There we go. All right, you guys, so I want to talk a little bit about the stuff picked up here today. So this one right here, we're going to do in class today as we go over things. And then the one that says chapter 15 BC on it, that stands as my notation about where I got it from. In our textbook, one of the main authors is Neil Campbell, and there's another textbook for like regular bio, not AP bio, in that the AP bio as a whole, the world calls the baby Campbell, because it's like a littler version of art. So that's what that stands for. So it's my notation of where I got this from. So I liked it because it's the same thing that we're going to be doing today. So this right here this is tonight here. So the first page front and back is all. So exercise 8, 6, and 7. All right. So I'm going to have you guys do. Okay.
So we're just in the first page?
Yes. All right. So that's that. Then these two here I put up on the board. These are going to be due the Wednesday we come back, but I thought I'd give them to you today instead of next week, so that if you wanted to do them over break, you could. Some people appreciate that, so that they're less stressed when they get back, especially if you're not going anywhere. All right. So that's that. And then this is the last, like, the review here. All right, and so that's what we have here. Plan is, the evolution test is going to be Thursday. All right. Somebody over in this vicinity over there. So it'll be on Thursday when we get back. Okay? So that's that. Okay, so we're going to today go through some more of chapter 25. All right, so I think this is where we left off. So systematists depict evolutionary relationships and branching phylogenetic trees. And so this, fast. And so you have a phylogenetic tree here. And so what this phylogenetic tree shows you is evolutionary relationships between, in this case here, 5 different organisms. So we have the leopard, so they're giving you the scientific binomial name here, and then the just normal layman's term name. So the leopard, the badger, the otter, coyote, and the wolf. And so in looking at this, I wanted to ask you here, it says, what does this phylogenetic tree indicate about the evolutionary relationships between the leopard, badger, and wolf? So between the leopard here, the badger, and the wolf. Is there anything that you can infer from this? Okay. All right, so the badger and leopard are more closely related. How do you know that? Hold on. What should we look at evolutionary relationships? The lines, all right? So I want to point out here that organisms that maybe if you just look here at where they're at, all right, like the badger and the leopard, since they're next to each other, does that mean they're more closely related? No, so we have to go back to the lines. So if we go back to the lines, what does it tell about these 3 organisms? We go back and look at the lines, okay? Leo?
The badger and the wolf are more closely related than the leopard.
All right, the badger and the wolf are more closely related than either one of them are to the leopard. And how do I know that? What am I looking at? Yeah, so I go back and find badger and the wolf's common ancestor on this? How do I find that? So I take the badger line and the wolf and go back until they meet. So right here, this point right here represents a common ancestor, and this branch here from one way to another, this branching represents a divergence. So the species diverges, and so then this is the common ancestor. Where is the common ancestor with the badger and the wolf to the leopard? This is way back over here, all right, at this divergence. And so therefore, because the badger and the wolf have a more recent common ancestor than either of them, the common ancestor to the leopard, then these guys, evolutionarily speaking, are more evolutionary related than the leopard, all right? And so that's what we can tell from a phylogenetic tree. So today we're going to talk about not only how to interpret these trees, we're going to talk about how to make them and so on. So that's what we're going to learn today. So a phylogenetic tree represents a hypothesis about evolutionary relationships. It's a hypothesis because you take the data that you currently have, DNA data, morphological data, fossil data, and so on, and try to make the best tree possible. But this tree is a hypothesis. If new data comes about, we can change this tree based upon what we found out. So each branch point, as we just talked about, represents the divergence into two species there. And then 6 sister taxa are groups that share an immediate common ancestor. And so that's what, so this picture here, did I go too fast again? At least my thing's working now. First hour, I tried to turn on my projector and it wouldn't turn on. Yes, and then the light bulb thing was flashing on. I had called downstairs, they read the manual, they called the technology person. So eventually by the end of the hour, they brought me this thing to use, and she got it all set up, she left, and it was the end of the hour. I go in the hallway, talking to some of the science teachers, and Mr. Broski goes, "Did you try going up and unplugging your projector?" And I said, "No, I didn't try that." So he comes up here, climbs up here, unplugs it, waits for a second, plugs it back in, and it's working. So now I know. So I have a backup. I have to return it to the library. So first hour was kind of interesting. So first hour is now watching. They're going to watch this video. Or first hour. Yeah. So anyway, this branch. So this is the branching point, the divergence I was just talking about. So this would be the common ancestor of all of these organisms, A through G. I just talked about sister taxa. So these guys are sister taxa because they share our most recent common ancestor there. All right, and so that's just how to read that. So what we can and cannot learn from phylogenetic trees. Trees show patterns of descent, not necessarily phenotypic similarity. So just because they don't look alike or does not mean that they don't share and are more closely related than organisms that do look alike. Trees do not indicate where species evolved or how much change occurred in a lineage. So unless the tree specifically says that the lines represent time, so when you go over here, unless it says this is time, and so on, we can't tell exactly from this tree, when the divergence happened. All right, and so we can't really make that assumption unless they tell us. Also, with the genetics, all right, how much change occurred in the lineage, and we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes here. And then it should not be assumed that a taxon evolved from the taxon next to it. So I already kind of hit that, all right? So on the right-hand side, just because they're next to each other does not necessarily mean they're more closely related, all right? And so we have to go back and look at the lines. So let's look at how to construct a phylogenetic tree. We use shared characteristics. So once homologous characters have been identified, they can be used to infer a phylogeny. So looking at this evolutionary relationship. So you have to decide what are you going to focus on to make this tree. And so this whole study is called cladistics, grouping organisms by common descent. And that word comes from the word clade, which is a group of species that include an ancestral species and all of its descendants. The key has to be all of its descendants here. And clades can be nested in larger clades, and I'll give an example of this. So a valid clade is called monophyletic, signifying it consists of the ancestor species and all its descendants. So this is an example circled of a monophyletic clade in this larger evolutionary tree. Why is it monophyletic? Let's look at the definition. It consists of an ancestor species and all of its descendants. So in this particular case, the ancestor species is right here, and it has all of its descendants as part of it, and so that's a monophyletic group. All right. There's two other types of groups. One called a paraphyletic, consists of an ancestral species and only some, but not all of the descendants. And a polyphyletic grouping consists of various species with different ancestors. So that's not, it doesn't include a common ancestor. Oh, go back. Alright, so this was the picture we just looked at. So in the same tree, a paraphyletic, notice here, here's the ancestral species, but we're only looking at D, E, and F, so it doesn't include all of this common ancestral species. G is left out here, so that's not complete, so that's a paraphyletic. And polyphyletic, notice here we're looking at A, B, C, and D, and it doesn't include a common ancestor for all of them, and so D is in this other branch here, and so it's kind of incomplete that way. And so that's the polyphyletic group, all right? And so, so that's a clade, all right? So a clade is a small portion of a larger tree. So now when we're making these trees, we look at two things, shared ancestral and shared derived characters. So in comparison with its ancestor, an organism has both shared and different characteristics. So if you look at the ancestor of an organism, the organism may have some of the characteristics the same as their ancestor, but then they might have new characteristics that the ancestor didn't have. So those are the shared ancestral and derived. So a shared ancestral character is a character that originated in an ancestor of the taxon. A shared derived character is an evolutionary novelty unique to a particular clade. It says a character can be both ancestral and derived depending on the context. Let me give you an example of that. So let's say we're talking about the clade of mammals, which we are a part of. So we are a mammal. Mammals, as a group of animals, have certain characteristics in common. So we have hair, mammary glands, and so on and so forth. So mammals have a certain set of characteristics. But we also have ancestral characteristics that our ancestors have as well. So for instance, like a spinal cord, all right, having vertebrae, is one characteristic that we as all mammals have, but it's not unique to mammals. Does that make sense? And so therefore a vertebrae would be a shared ancestral character that mammals share with their ancestors. The derived characters would be the characters that are unique to mammals, all right? And so that make a mammal, okay? And so that's what that means. And so, and we'll go through some examples here. So, when looking at and inferring these evolutionary relationships, it's useful to know in which clade a shared derived character first appeared. So where do we first see this character? So, go too fast again? So in comparing evolutionary relationships here, we have, I'm going to show you how this tree was made using some data here. So we have 6 different organisms here, from the lancelet to the leopard. And so how they made this, this tree is by looking at characteristics that the organisms have. And so they chose, let's look at this, so this was made before this was made. So let's talk about how they did this. So here are the organisms, that's the taxa, the groups, that's the plural for taxon. So those are your organisms, and then they chose certain characters to compare. So vertebral column or the backbone, hinged jaws, 4 walking legs, amnion, and the hair. All right, so that's what the characteristics that they looked for. And it doesn't say here, but the 0 in this chart means that the organism doesn't have that character. 1 means they have the character. Okay, so I'm looking at the lancelet, notice here has 0s for each one of them. So what they literally do is look at the organisms and kind of check off, where they have this, the 0, all right, and so on and so forth. Then they do the same thing with the lamprey and see whether or not they have it, and so on and so forth. And so then we look at it, and so then compare it. So if we notice here, these are the traits that we're looking at. None of them are found in the lancelet. So here's the common ancestor. So none of these traits are in the lancelet. So we have a divergence. We put the lancelet there that doesn't have any of those traits. And then we make a second branch. And notice that all of the rest of the organisms besides lancelet has the vertebral column. So therefore, what they did is they made this branch here and put this character here, vertebral column. That means that anything stemming from that branch, they all have that characteristic. All right? And so then we take the next most common characteristic. So we look here, these 4 have hinged jaws, the lamprey doesn't. And so here, since the lamprey doesn't, but it does have a vertebral column, we put the lamprey out next, and then this next branch, everything stemming off of that branch will have a hinged jaw. Following me? All right. And then we go to the next most common here, so the 4 walking legs, these 3 have it. Now the new one that doesn't have it is the bass, all right? And so we go from there, so we put the next bass, and then everything beyond here has the 4 walking legs. So then, look over here, the amnion, the frog doesn't have it, but the turtle and leopard does. All right, so we have here the frog. All right, and then the turtle and leopard here, and we put amnion here. And lastly, distinguishing between the turtle and the leopard. The turtle doesn't have here, and the leopard does, and so we put it here there. All right, and therefore we make this phylogenetic tree. And so, so this is called a phylogenetic tree, and we can look at so they choose certain things to make this tree from, looking at, in this case, certain characteristics. All right, and so that's how this is made. So what I'm going to have us do before we move on is now I'm going to have you look at that sheet that says phylogeny practice. So for first hour watching this, that's this sheet. All right, you guys. let's go over this. So for the green, guys, the green, blue, and orange lineages. So here they are right here. And so monophyletic group means that you have those organisms and it has to include their common ancestor. The common ancestor is here. So let's just go back like that. Okay? So that is. Then B asks you to draw an arrow that represents the common ancestor. I just kind of did that. That's here. And then C asks you to indicate the root. The root is where the whole common ancestor of the whole tree would be. So this would be a root here. And then D, an arrow indicating time, and so that would be here, old. Alright. Or recent, I should say. Alright, then number 2 asks you to compare these 4 to the one up here and circle the ones that show a different set of relationships among the colors. And so in this particular case, there's 2 that you should have circled here. We should have B and C circled here. So let's talk about why that is. If you just look at the relationship here with the root, pink comes off and everything else stems off of a second branch. So if we notice here right away in B, that doesn't happen. B has 2 branches, orange branches off, and everything is off of the orange. And so that's right there that tells us that that's not showing the same relationship. But it does do that here for C. The pink branches off and everything's branched off here. So then if we look at the next branch, we have purple branched off from everything else. And so that's where we have a discrepancy here, because here's purple, but purple and green are coming off the same branch, and orange are, and that's not what's depicted up above. Alright, so that's what B and C. I do just want to point out here that it's not the order, like this one here for A, this is the same relationship, and I just want to say that it doesn't have to be the same order. So notice here is pink, green, orange, blue, purple. And it's a different order above here, but remember, it's not about what's going on up here, it's about the relationship with the lines. And so we see here that we do have pink and everything else branching off of there. Then purple and everything else. So if we look here, here's purple, and the rest of them are branched off, so that's what we see here. Then green is branched off, and then orange and blue are together, and that's what we see here, green and orange and blue together. So that's showing you the same relationship that this one is. So we're just looking at the lines and how and where the common ancestors are and so on and so forth. So, and then the same thing with this one here, they just flipped it around. And so, you know, purple, here's the root for this one. And so then everything else comes off of there. And then purple stems from everything else. You see here, purple stems from everything else. Then green and orange and blue, green, orange and blue. So it's the exact same set of relationships. And so I just went over that with number 3 here. And so then lastly, number 4 asks you about which is true about this particular diagram, and B is true. Alright, the crocodile is more closely related to a bird than a lizard. Alright, so let me point out here, this right here is called a cladogram. It shows evolutionary relationships kind of like a phylogenetic tree, and it's just drawn a little bit differently. And so, but you can kind of tell similar things about the organisms in that as well as the tree itself. So, put this back here. So let me illustrate that. I'm going to illustrate that with this picture here. So this is a phylogenetic tree right here, and I want to just draw a cladogram that would show the same thing. So you could draw it like this information that we just went over here, but this is a cladogram. You have to draw a straight line, and you have your ancestral, so we have the lancelet here coming off, and the lancelet doesn't have any of the characteristics. So then we can put here that this is the vertebral column, And that means that anything else on this line, any other organism on here has a vertebral column. So then we can put here, coming off of here, the lamprey. I'll just put the lamprey. And then everything else after that has a hinged jaw. All right, following me? All right, then we have the bass. All right, then we have the 4 walking legs. Then you have the frog. I'm gonna make this longer here, so we have the amnion. And then we would have the turtle coming off of here. And the very end then, we don't have to make another one here, the very end would be the leopard. And what distinguishes that is the hair. So this right here tells us the same information as this tree. You see that? All right. So that's called a cladogram. And so we call the lancelet the outgroup because this is kind of the ancestor of these guys. It doesn't really have any of the characteristics that we're talking about with these. So then all of these, the lamprey, the bass, the frog, the turtle, and so on, they would be what we call the in-group. These are the ones that we're looking at with these 4 characteristics. They're part of that group that we're looking at that has the vertebral column and so on. So the lancelet's kind of on there as an ancestral species. All right, so in some trees, the length of a branch can reflect the number of genetic changes that have taken place in a particular DNA sequence in that lineage. So remember I said when you're looking at a tree that you necessarily can't assume time and when things happen and so on. And so that's the case with DNA here. So looking at a particular DNA sequence. So this is a tree that the length of the lines represent DNA changes. So the number of genetic changes that have taken place in that lineage. So what does this mean? So here's the ancestor of these 3 organisms here, and so we have this divergence. This length of line is longer, so it's showing you that if this is representing with DNA changes, that line represents the amount of DNA that must have changed from this organism to the chicken. So therefore the length of the line is important. And so then here, we have from here to here, from this ancestor to this ancestor, there's this much change, and then from the mouse and human to the mouse, this much change. So they're relative, the lines are relative to based upon how much genetic change is happening. So if you notice here, if we go back to here, we look at here the lancelet, lots of genetic change has occurred from a common ancestor of the lancelet to everything else here. All right, and so the length, and that's why, do you see how the lines are kind of in the organisms are not all lined up on the right hand side, they're all in different places, and that's because it represents the genetic change. So it has to tell you that about the tree. We can't assume that. If it says, hey, this is based upon genetic changes, then we can assume that. Sometimes trees, the branch length represents time. And they can make these kind of trees from the fossil record. So branching points can be determined from the fossil record. So that's this tree here. So here's time, they're giving you a scale, and so they have divergence based upon the fossil record of when things diverge and so on, and they can scale it to a certain time. And notice here, as long as these are all living, they're all lined up here at the present time, all right? What if you had an organism, see these are all still alive, what if you had an organism that is now extinct but you found a fossil? Would the line go all the way to the present? No, all right, so it would be wherever that last fossil was found, okay? All right, and so again, they have to tell you that this is showing you time. All right, so when making these trees, there are often more than one way to make them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how do they know which tree is kind of the best hypothesis. So they can never be sure of finding the best tree, especially if you have a very large data set. so they narrow the possibilities by applying the principles of what we call maximum parsimony and maximum likelihood. Maximum parsimony assumes that the tree that requires the fewest evolutionary events is the most likely. The principle of maximum likelihood states that given certain rules about how DNA changes over time, a tree can be found that reflects the most likely sequence of evolutionary events. So we say, okay, and usually the one that's the most likely, it has the fewest changes that has to occur. And I'm going to show you an example of that here. So this chart here shows you, says the percentage difference between sequences. And so what we're talking about here is, when we talk about sequence here, they're talking about DNA sequences. So when you compare the DNA between a human and a human for, let's say, specific genes or something like that, there's 0 differences. Human to a mushroom in that same gene, 30% difference. Human to a tulip, 40% difference. And then human mushroom to mushroom, 0. Mushroom to tulip, also 40. And tulip to tulip, 0. So this is our data. And so from this differences, we can construct genetic trees. All right, so we have only 3 are phylogenetic trees. We only have 3 organisms here. So here are 2 examples of a tree. And so we could have, in this case here, there's the root, and we have the human and the mushroom coming off the same branch, and the tulip over here. And in this one, obviously, we have the mushroom and the branching off by itself, and then the human and the tulip. And so, so let me talk about what these numbers mean and how they made these based upon this. Based upon this data here. I'm going crazy here. There we go. All right. So what they're saying here. Here's the common ancestor, and so here's the divergence. So what they're saying here is the tulip. The DNA for this gene has changed 20% based upon the DNA in the common ancestor. Here, between this ancestor and this one here, there's a 5% change. Then, as this common ancestor diverged here, we have, between this common ancestor and the human is a 15% change. Between this common ancestor and a mushroom is 15% change. Now, how did they do this? So that when they branched this out, remember we had, let's say, between a human and a mushroom, there was a 30% change. So let's look at why this makes sense in the diagram here. So between a human and a mushroom, there's 30% change. So how does this match that? So if we go back to the human and the mushroom's common ancestor here, remember that between this DNA and the human, there's a 15% change. Between this and the mushroom, there's a 15% change. So 15% change here, 15% change here. So we have a 30% difference between the human and the mushroom. All right, so then when we look at, let's say human and tulip, what percent change should we have just looking at this? Human and a tulip looking at this. What percent difference in the DNA? How would you figure that out? Based upon the example I just used. Roman? It is 40%. So we go back, here's the human and the tulip, go back to the common ancestor. So the human, from this common ancestor, there's a 5% change and an additional 15% change. So from here to here is a total of 20%. And then the tulip, there's a 20% change. So it's the difference change between a human and a tulip, 20 and 20, which is 40%. So therefore, they all match the same data that is on the previous slide. And so then the second chart shows here a different matchup here. And so notice here that the lines, notice here that all of these represent, so from here, this common ancestor is 20% change from here to here, 20% change here, 20% change here. So therefore the same percent change occurred, and that's why they're all, the lines are all matched up. Here, notice the lines are all over the place here, and the organisms aren't lined up here, and that's because the lines in this case are representing genetic change. So here, from this common ancestor, this is saying that the mushroom only changed 5% of the time, so we have a very short line here because that's not a lot of genetic change. Between this common ancestor and this one here was 10% change, so we have a longer line than we do with the 5. And then from there, 15% change, but 25% change, so we have the longer line here. But if we add them all up, so like the difference between a human and a tulip is still, here's the common ancestor, all right, there's 15 and 25, so we add those together, and you get 40, which that's what it says, human and tulip is 40%. And we can, it adds up correctly for all of the other ones. This one, it says, notice here, less likely. This is more likely. The reason why this is more likely is because in studying a lot of genes in a lot of organisms over time, the rate of how the organisms kind of change over time usually is close to the same. So this is showing you kind of the same rate for each of the organisms. This is what this is saying is that there was some change in the mushroom and then it slowed down and there was very little change over time. Versus here on the tulip is saying it was like changing a lot, all right? So from the common ancestor, and so this one is more likely because of rates that. So we're making a hypothesis that that's more likely. Is it for sure that that one's more likely? No, all right. It's not a proof. It's just more. It's a better hypothesis. So as you can imagine, we have lots of living things, lots of traits to look at in comparing, and so they have pretty sophisticated computer programs that you type in and will search for trees that are most likely. All right, so let's look at this here. I'm going to teach you here how to figure out which is the best hypothesis using these 3 species of birds. So so these are the 3 species, and they have just 3 different trees ways that they could branch off of one another. So species, here's the ancestor, so species 1 and 2 have a more recent common ancestor, and then species 3, or 1 and 3, and then species 2 is out here, or 2 and 3 and species 1. So those are our 3 hypotheses. And so we're going to look to see which hypothesis is the most likely. So what you do is you look at a trait. And so in this case here, what we're going to look at is this right here. This is DNA sequence. So this is the order of the bases in a section of DNA. And so notice here, here's the ancestral sequence. So this is an ancestor to the other 3 species. And so here's species 1, 2, and 3. And so we're comparing a section of DNA. And you're going back and comparing it to what the ancestor was to see if there's any change that occurred in the DNA. So that's the first thing we're going to look at. And so then notice along the top, it has site. So this they call just 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's a very small sequence of DNA. And so in site 1, the ancestral species is A. So therefore, 1 and 2, that A at some point in time from the ancestral species has mutated to a C. So it's changed to a C. So what do? They take, and I know this looks a little bit busy here, but let me show you on this here. Here are those 3 hypotheses about their relationship. What they did is said, okay, 1 and 2 are the only ones that had a mutation to change from the ancestral sequence. So therefore, notice in this chart, 1 and 2 stem from the same common ancestor. So that mutation at site 1, what this means is 1/C means that it's site 1 and that it mutated to a C. That mutation only has to happen 1 time. So they put a little slash mark to represent the change, because the change occurred in the common ancestor that affects both 1 and 2. But notice here, species 1 and 2 are not off the same branch here. So in order for this one to have the mutation in 1 and 2, the mutation has to happen twice. Once for number 1 and once for number 2. And then here, the same thing for 1 and for 2. So then we do this for all the other sites. So let me just show you here. So site 2, the ancestral species is a G. species 3 stays the same, 1 and 2 differ, so it mutates to a T from a G. So then we go back here, and how they did this diagram here, they're showing you the first one to get the hang of it, and then they put sites 2 through 4, 2, 3, and 4 on one tree here. And so 2 would the mutation is for species 1 and 2, so that's the same. It affects 1 and 2, 1 and 2, and then 1 and 2. So it had to happen 2 times there. So then site 3, who mutates or who deviates from the ancestral species? What species? What deviates? Well, ancestral is a T. 1 and 3 do, because they're different. And so then we go back over here, and so 1 and 3, so we're at site 3, so they put a 3 here for 1, and it has to happen again for 3. But notice here, 1 and 3 are off the same branch here, so it only has to mutate 1 time to affect both of those. So they put the mutation here, and then 1 and 3. Again, it has happened 2 times. And then lastly, site 4, here says a T, that's the same, so the mutation occurs in 2 and 3. And so then we see a 4 here at 2 and 3, a 4 here at 2 and 3, and then 2 and 3 are together here, so they only have to put it once there. All right? And so, so that's how they look at the mutations, and so in this case, the genetic differences. So now, notice what they did in this last row. So they combined all the mutations at once. So here's 1, 2, so 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they just tallied them all on one and figured out how many changes would have to happen. So this one, there's 6, 7, and 7. So which one would be most likely? The first one, because it's the one with the fewest events, is probably most likely, all right? And so that's the hypothesis then. And that's how they kind of work through trees and so on, all right? And so this is where I'll stop off. And so tomorrow, just the first page, front and back of the chapter 15 BC. And packet, and then we'll start off tomorrow where I'm going to have you do something like this on your own. All right? Yes. Like the front and back
of the first.
Be clear, Roman. What, Abby?